Merry Christmas, Reverend David. They sent me a notification about sound. So if somebody on the sidebar could let me know if you don't hear me. And of course, if you don't hear me, you didn't hear what I just said. And yes, of course, Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and all good tidings to all men and women of good cheer, and everybody else too, for that matter. Well, here we are approaching this holiday season, and it's the most unusual holiday of record, at least in the last 20 years, if not for my lifetime, depending on how everything shakes out, of course. But it seems to be that there's a light is trying to come in, and whenever the light tries to enter, there's always that darkness that can reveal itself at the same time. And of course, unless it's the light that casts no shadow, the light of Christ, the light of the realm of the Elohim, where they dwell at the juncture of space and time, the highest beings capable of that, according to Rudolf Steiner. But in any event, so let's open up the cracks and let in more light, like our friends in the Sufis, like Rumi, and then that, of course, that Zen poet from Canada, Leonard Cohen. It's the cracks where the light gets in. And so this is that time of year when we go to the winter solstice. And around that time, we find ourselves with the shortest days and the longest nights. And so as we enter into that relative darkness, we have to become the source of that light. And that is the possibility of participating in being a solution to challenges rather than a victim. And if anything, you could say that this time is a time of joy and celebration. So why don't we bear all that? And how's the celebration coming over there across the pond in London, David?
I've just discovered I might be homeless by the 19th of this month, so I can't say I'm feeling particularly Christmassy at the minute. I thought things were well, but apparently they're not. Yeah, I mean, it's good to remember that it's always darkest before the dawn, and certainly this is a very unusual Yuletide. But I couldn't let you down, because this is, you're not only my friend, this is such a very good show. I suppose what's on my mind at the minute is never take things for granted, and be careful, because unless everyone's trying to do the right thing, there can always be a slip up. I suppose I'm reminded of the tradition on the continent where St. Nicholas is always surrounded by the Krampus, which Americans, with due respect and love to all of my American chums, don't really seem to get the gist of. It's not an open celebration of terrible things. It's a reminder that darkness and limitation, as you said a minute ago, tend to foreshadow the coming of a much greater good. So that's the idea there. And I noticed that particular custom is gaining new gusto as the decades go on, and I personally love it all. I mean, you know, the idea is St. Nicholas isn't threatened by these things. He's a saint. He's not on his own. He's got Christ on his side. Therefore, it's just the way things are in this particular dispensation. So, yeah, I mean, I wish things not only were getting a bit Christmassier, what a terrible word, for me, but also generally in London. I mean, if ever there was a lackluster season, I'm totally jealous of your luminous tree, and I can see a a Santa Claus behind you. Isn't that gorgeous? I'm totally jealous of that. And sort of trying to get rid of the feeling of, oh, I love the bow on the top. That's lovely. Don't you have fairies on the top, like in Britain? The tradition is a fairy on the top of a Christmas tree. A couple of years back, I put it. Oh, isn't that lovely too? Look at that. Good heavens. And a winged angel ready to announce the incarnation. That is absolutely beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I think what they do in London at the minute is underplay the festive season, which is not a good idea. And it doesn't really placate Muslims because they don't need placating. What they need is someone to say a Merry Christmas to them and they get it back. Most of the Muslims I know are very open, very fair hearted and warm hearted, and they rather like it being said to them. But politics has become so much like ancient Rome in Britain at the minute. It's ruthless, it's toxic. You only ever hear partial truths, and that really is colouring the city, desperately trying to survive a festive season, which is being inflicted on it. The rules are getting ridiculous and irrational day by day. No more than six, then more than six, then, oh my God, everyone's going to die of COVID-19 in January. And no, we're not really hiding Brexit. That's completely tangential. Yada, 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 yada. I might be a libertarian, but as I think I've said before, I was completely against Brexit. My view is if you're having a row with someone, you have to be at the table, not run away from the table. Because that solves nothing. But yeah, I mean, despite the Christmas lights being up in Oxford Street, despite the fact this, of course, is the run up to Christmas now, I wish I could say it was more Christmassy here, John. But overall, it's not. It's not. It's a conflicted nation at a very, very conflicted time, with the one rejoinder that most people know now here that they're being taken for a ride. So the feeling is sullen. It's rather sad and not the Christmas I'm used to from previous decades. I mean, the ghost of Christmas present has yet to turn up, as far as I can see, and I hope he does so soon because we all need a bit of a lift. I'll pass it back over to you. I'm sorry to give such depressing news.
Well, that's I always wait with bated breath to find out what Reverend David's going to come up with as a response to my oft times peculiar tirades. But that's a good one. Yeah. Well, it's the grumpus, isn't it? It's like that's like he's the guy that's going to leave you a piece of coal if you haven't been good. And so actually that's very telling regarding the British modality. It's because it is fundamentally an economic empire. I mean, although there's no longer the British Empire where the sun never sets, nonetheless, they never left. In places wherever they were, there's always a British presence there, and so it goes back to what I was discussing last week about how Rudolf Steiner described the difference between the French movement into the modern age and the British, that the idea of the individuality was the key issue in the French Revolution with the liberty, equality, and fraternity. They just had trouble understanding what those three words meant, in what realms they were applicable. Whereas the British, on the other hand, he describes them as seeing it as more of a all mankind view of what was to come about in this period. And so they have an innate tendency to want to spread themselves over the whole earth. And they've figured out that the ideal way to do that is by corporate mergers. And so They are very clever. And so they're out there and they're tied into the drama directly of what's going on here with that whole Dominion thing with Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who even got mentioned by Rudy Giuliani. But we could talk about that some other time. I think at this time, I'm just more interested in this whole idea of that we're living in a riddle, and it becomes increasingly important to be able to understand uh, the words of the poet, Austrian, uh, Bohemian poet, really, uh, who's usually considered to be German, Rainer Maria Rilke. He said, "Be patient towards all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything, live the questions." And that, I think, perfectly, and as usual with Rilke, with his gift of language, he gives you such a wide encirclement of a topic that it allows you a space in which you can dive into and enter into the thought as to what it might be, because it's a riddle. And if you go back to the dialogues of Plato, for example, what does Socrates do? The Socratic method is based upon questions, and questions are riddles. And the central scene within the Grail mysteries is the inability of Parsifal to ask the question, what ails you, when he's confronted with the wounded king. And so you see that it's an entering into this with this vulnerability. And if you go to the other side of the wheel and consider Golgotha, you'd see that what did Jesus Christ reveal to us? He created the greatest capacity for vulnerability, that he allowed that moment to exist. And see, if you look at that in terms of spiritual science, Rudolf Steiner makes the point about Lucifer striving to the immaterial and Ahriman, or the Satanic principle, striving towards materiality. And then you see that in looking at this, what can we do to find balance between these two imbalance tendencies of which we all share in? Because with Lucifer, you have the arrogance. And as Roseanne Barr was so nicely put it on my show with her the other day, she quoted the Zohar, the ancient, hundreds of years old text of the Kabbalah. And in there it says, she said that the Zohar says that arrogance always comes with ignorance. And so you say, well, that to me, that was a good one, because you see, what is ignorance? It's not that you're not smart enough. It's that you don't have it. You're ignorant of it. It's a void in your awareness. And so how do we fill that void? And that's by opening it up and allowing that vulnerability to take place. So that presses back Ahriman, because see, Rudolf Steiner said, if one could go through life with a sense of being satisfied with your current lot in life, not that you shouldn't strive, but that just by being satisfied and not being all agitated and you're living in this wishing that you had something that's over there and you're over here, or what have you. However far you want to take it, if you could just have a mood of soul of being satisfied, that presses back Ahriman out of your unconscious uh, realm of the will, we could call it. And through maintaining a humility, we can push back that arrogance of Lucifer. And so there's that equilibrium again, which allows the proper light to come in. Because again, Lucifer's the effulgent light. He's that reflected light because he is not the source of the light. And that's the thing that confuses people, because Lucifer means the light bringer. Yeah, then they show him with a lantern. It's not his light. He doesn't own the light. The light comes from the realm of the exousiae, from the spirits of form. That's that realm of the Elohim that dwells between and is the highest level of being that's capable of dwelling both within and without space and time. And that is the being, the representative of that realm that Moses was able to encounter. And that's what guided him, and that's what was able to appear in the burning bush. So that being of the sun beings, that highest level of sun beingness that can develop a personal relationship with the beings within space and time. That's a wonderful concept to be able to dwell in. And so now we come into the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that we've been experiencing. And that's considered by some scholars to be the Star of Bethlehem, that it was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the two planets coming together, and several years, 3 BC. And ultimately, I believe that's the date. I didn't know I was going to be talking about this, as is our usual affair here, that we just tend to see what triggers in the mind. But so you have the image of, that's the Solomon experience, in the sense of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, because that ties into the three magi that came for the Jesus child, to find the Jesus child. And so you have, they're traditionally called Casper, Balthazar, and Melchior. And they're bearing the tradition that came out of the school of Zarathustra during the reign of Cyrus, and of which Pythagoras was a student of that school, as was Cyrus. And so you have that messianic impulse, but it's a universally human messianic impulse, so that people even at that time couldn't fully comprehend its universally human nature, that it's not just concerned with bringing an impulse for the people of Israel, because extending beyond the birth of Christ Jesus, the universally human aspect of it is flowed forth. Whereas leading up to that event, that's the ancestral gift of the Hebrew nation. And that's really relevant at this time, because, as I frequently make reference to, the war in heaven that culminated in 1879, that started in the 1840s, because it's that impulse that drove down certain harmonic spirits to earth, to where they want to inhabit the minds of human beings. And so you see Rudolf Steiner giving those great series of lectures during World War I, where he was speaking most pointedly against this or about this development within the cultural scene, because leading up to 1879, the wholesome spirits of light were attended to the forces of the family and the nation being, and that blood tie relationship thing was very strong. But that came to a culmination in 1879, and with the spirits of conflict and hindrance, the spirits that want to work in a potentially inimical way towards mankind, were the antagonists against that bloodline impulse leading up to 1879. After that, that became their strategy. Now they're the ones that are putting forward all kinds of relative basis coming from the idea of one's race or nation or all these potentially divisive forces, so that we should be moving beyond that into the universally human. And so, if anything, I like to see Christmas as a universally human event.
Gosh, excuse me, where on earth do I start answering those points? Yeah, I mean, there's something unique about the Christmas period, the Christmas holiday. Let nothing ye affright. Remember, Christ our Saviour was born on Christmas night. I mean, I can't remember whether that verse survived or not. God rest ye merry gentlemen and all that. I mean, Annie Lennox did an incredible version of that old Christmas carol a couple of years ago, where she caught the whole spirit of the sort of the troubadours, the wandering troupe of players going between villages. Puts all other holidays to shame. Embracing true love and brotherhood. I'm paraphrasing quickly. An incredibly talented performer who really knew the essence of what that particular carol was trying to get at. Despite all of the doom and gloom and the uncertainty, this is still the holiest of holiest holidays apart from Easter. Yes, it's a universal thing. Anyone that thinks Christmas is just for a couple of born again Christians who don't really approve of the pagan bits anyway. No, I mean, we've got to really grow up a bit. And there's nothing wrong with a Christmas tree, and there's nothing wrong with a Christmas wreath, and there's nothing wrong with eggnog, and there's nothing. I love that Christmas tree. There's nothing wrong with presents, and there's nothing wrong with most of it. Let's face it. And there are enough real things to be frightened of in the world without a few things like that. I remember, this will shock everybody, a self-confessed Christian existentialist. I suppose I'm allowed to go and look at materials that other people wouldn't allow themselves to look at. I remember seeing The Life of Brian many years ago, Monty Python, and there's magic to this show, John. The way you and I spark each other, the Pew days were magical, but dare I say this is better, because it's fun, and it's just you and me managing to develop themes. I think that's wonderful. No disrespect to the Pew, and love the Pew to bits, but there's a genuine, unique magic to this show. Life of Brian, I remember to this day I mean, I never understood why people got on their high horses about that. I actually heard Michael Palin years ago, a couple of years after the release of the movie, talking St. James's in Piccadilly, about the fact he was shocked because he said very clearly there are two clear scenes about the Christ, and they're very respectful and they're very traditional. What they were getting at was the hypocrisy of organized religion. And you actually see, before Brian's giving his 5 penneth worth on the Mount, you actually see a very classic Jesus figure on the Sermon on the Mount. And what amused me there was what happened to the people at the back, and that somebody says, "What did he say then?" And the man stood next to us says, "Look, I can't hear it. He's saying it over there to the crowd, the crowd at the front." So I thought that was wonderful, because that's human. But the bit that really gets me to this day was where the 3 wise men, since we're talking about the Magi, get the wrong address and they turn up to Brian and his mum's house, and it's not what they were expecting at all. And she says, "Who are you then?" To which they reply, "We're astrologers." So of course she gets the wrong end of the stick altogether and says, "Well, what sign is he then?" And they say, "Well, he's Capricorn. If he's born now, he's Capricorn." And this huge row breaks out where they've just got the wrong address. The penny drops and they storm their way out to the actual very classical nativity scene just down the road a bit, where you get the Blessed Virgin, St. Joseph, and the child with a luminous halo around its head. So, what we think we know and what we don't know. So it's all there if you look about it. Oh, the Magi. I mean, for me, that has so many connotations. I can't remember whether I was saying it on this show or another show. They were actually removed, I think it was in early Victorian times, from scripture itself. How can people have the audacity to remove elements from scripture just because we don't understand it all? Doesn't, at a particular time, doesn't mean it should be removed. The Magi, of course, were pagans. They were Zoroastrian priests. As I think I have said on this show before, you never hear a bad word against Persians in the Bible because, of course, they were the liberators of the Jews from Babylon. And also, our theology is linked in with theirs somehow very deeply and mysteriously. So they were removed from the text as the three wise men, which was absolutely appalling. Why? Because it raised too many questions. Why were pagan priests the first people to recognize divinity? And of course, there are whole libraries that could be written about that. And of course, the next thing that comes to mind is, well, actually, were they pagan? Or is it part of an ongoing tradition which the Jews themselves dialogue with, which they themselves link into in some way? And I think some of the rabbis I've met are certainly very open to that opinion. And the star, I mean, as you said yourself, is it really meant to be taken that literally, or is it the star of faith that leads to divinity within us all? I mean, surely, if we're wise enough to pursue that, then nothing but rebirth is bound to follow. Oh no, this is a truly glorious time. I mean, in my own delvings, I always found the Jewish material, which I respect hugely deeply. I always found it just, there's so much to deal with. My view is always Platonism. I don't see why existentialists, and the real ones they don't write it all off. They're just saying, okay, where is all it leading? What does it mean? How do we get to there from here? And I think those are legitimate questions. So for me, it was always Platonism, which, because I'm European, that offered me those insights. And of course, that might be the model of the Trinity in the Orthodox Church. I'm not so sure you can say that in the Catholic Church. No, I'm not saying they made up the Trinity. What I am saying is they were using philosophical, theoretical models that made sense to the communities at that particular time. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're talking about, supernatural mysteries, you've got to start somewhere. So for me, it was always that. I mean, I dipped in to Zohar. A friend of mine, Ahmed, who will remain nameless any further than that, a Muslim bought me the complete set of the Zohar not too long ago as a gift, and I was very, very grateful. I dipped into Kabbalah, but there are only, as I was saying to you before, there are only so many hours in the day. I like sleeping, I like eating. I think that, plus the fact that MCC, needs to be defended of all things, as opposed to actually worked within. I mean, I can't believe that Christmassy things like homophobia are resurfacing. They are. I'll before I pass it back to you, I'll just mention one meme. I shouldn't get so populist, should I? I love one meme I saw during the week of the nativity scene without refugees, without Jews, and without anything supernatural. And it was a couple of cattle looking at a hay trough, because the minute you get rid of all those difficulties, then there's absolutely nothing left. And I thought, oh my God, that's actually for me an inverse way of saying let's all have a Merry Christmas, despite the problems that are surrounding us, because there are wonderful things like friendship. There's John Barnwell over there, sat next to his glorious Christmas tree, And yet let's celebrate as usual the positive, accentuate what's good and beautiful and true, and try and work our way forward in that direction. Certainly, to my own mind, existentialism. I met Bertrand Russell. I was very, very young. He was very, very old. I asked him, "Do you think there is anything to Christianity?" Yes, I know he wrote a book called Why Not a Christian. And he looked me square in the face and said, "Look, I can see why someone becomes a Quaker." Well, that's the opening of the stable door, then, isn't it? You know, I mean, so okay, he didn't go any further with that, I hasten to add. But that for me was an admission of two things. He wasn't really sure of what European existentialists were getting at, which actually always leads to the supernatural. They don't go there, but it always leads back to it. And it also opens opens our vision to what is Christianity. Is it just inherited churches? Is it just institutions? Is it just buildings? Right. One last thing, and I promise I'll shut up. There was a song by Lou Reed I remember years back, where what was it? You need a busload of faith to get by. I can't remember the title of the song offhand. And the way he's saying, "Oh, you can't trust the church unless it's real estate that you want to buy." And I was thinking, well, the only trouble with those criticisms is they're true, but that doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's another Christmassy allusion. It doesn't moan. Doesn't mean you. It does mean you moan. If you're a pastor, it means you moan. It doesn't mean you forget all that's glorious and good and true within the tradition and what it means for us on a cultural and personal level, because this is a time of the holy, a time of the good, and one of the most beautiful times of the year. I will cheer up, even if I'm walking the streets without a fixed abode, looking forward to Crimbo in my Dickensian manner and trying to shake off the snow, although it hardly ever snows here till February. But I think it's a wonderful time no matter what. I'll shut up now and pass back to you, John. There we are.
Well, going back to the beginning of that vignette, God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. And that's how the song opens, isn't it? So it's let nothing you dismay. That's an interesting concept, which is reminiscent of the Persian legend. Since we're speaking of Persian, the Persian legend of Jesus walking with his disciples, and they come across the dead dog on the side of the road, and they bend and look at it and comment how ugly it was. And Jesus says, "But look at how beautiful his teeth are." So it's up to us to find some kindling to keep that warmth in the heart pouring out into the world, right? We have to begin to become our own sun and allow ourselves to be vehicles of that's greater than us, right? And of course, the easiest way to do that is through community. And so the whole idea of having a congregation it's a group of people coming together, and as Jesus Christ said, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, I am in the midst of them. And that's the key to the mystery, is that there's that capacity to be able to connect to others, to be concerned, and that falls in with the indications of Rudolf Steiner, where he also said that Lucifer, he's like indifferent. He could care less about, who cares about those people? That's like a perfect example of what he's talking about. And through caring for others, we can bring forward our relationship to this. Of course, it's something that's moment by moment, like everything else. But it reminds me of the article from a talk that Aaron Pfeiffer gave. He's the founder of biodynamic gardening here in the U.S. and one of my biggest influences, regarding his astronomical perspective in his astronomical diagrams that form the basis of both of my books. Oh, by the way, the books. Yeah, I can't forget the books. How long have we been talking? I have so much fun talking here that I forget to talk about things I'm supposed to address. And the books are in the other room, but you can always find them listed below the video. Sometimes the links become disabled, so then you have to copy and paste them because they don't want me pulling things forward freely. That brings up the other topic, because just as Lucifer is indifferent to other people, Ahriman, what does he do? Well, he wants to control other people, right? And that's to unite with them in the wrong way, so to speak. And whereas Lucifer wants to disconnect and be self-centered, Ahriman wants to just be totally on top of everything. The singularity, shall we call it, in modern parlance. But David is the author of several books. And the next time he chats, what I'm going to do is run into the other room, and then I can bring books in here while he's chatting. So let's go back to this Persian thing for the time being, because it's so critical. Because you were saying that you're positing a connection between the Jewish people and the Persian Zoroastrian tradition of Zarathustra and all of that. And of course, that is key, because I already mentioned the school of Zarathos. And in the school of Zarathos was, like I said, there was Pythagoras, there was the Cyrus, the ruler. And Cyrus is critical because he's one that enabled the building of the Second Temple. And he's an interesting character because he's not flawless. He was chosen, okay? He's not like one of the anointed saints, but he serves the purposes of God, right? And so he was able to free them to be able to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and have their national identity. And so he was able to serve the forward-moving, wholesome forces of light. But also present in that school were a couple of the prophets, Hebrew prophets. Now, but if you look in the Islamic tradition, for example, they have what are known as peoples of the book. And included in that are the Jews, the Christians, but they also include the Zoroastrians, and which ties into Zarathustra, and they also include the Sabians, which has to do with the Sabians when they were confronted. They asked they were asked what their scripture was, and they didn't really approach things scripturally, but they said, okay, this, and they basically gave them the Hermetic writings, which is very interesting, so that you have key aspects of evolution that are developed in the works of Rudolf Steiner, because the whole image of what Hermes represents as the transformed realm of the astral, whereas in the Mosaic tradition you have the transformed realm of the etheric, and all of these of which connect to the mystery surrounding Zarathustra of the Persian period. And so being in the age of Gemini, so 2,160-year periods within the precession of the equinox, and going back, that was in the second post-Atlantean period after the old Indian period of the Manu and the seven rishis. And so you see that impulse carried forward into the plains of Iran. And in Iran, which Iran is like, that word means Aryan, and it's like not any kind of pejorative. It's just happens to be the name of some people. Of course, like words get weaponized and used in the wrong way many times, but consequently, Iran developed a remarkable culture, and you see the influx of these various regions, and there's this great cross pollination. And so Rudolf Steiner makes the point about when the school of the philosophers, the Greek school of the philosophers, was closed by the edict, that the philosophers they came into the Middle East and entered into Syria and southwestern Iran, and you see these translations of the Greek writings going into Syriac, and from Syriac into Arabic. And so all these things are all very much intermingled. But out of that impulse came the development of natural science, which has ultimately devolved or evolved. But it's into the whole concept of utilitarianism, materialism, and reductionism. And so that's that shadow aspect of it, the to be captivated by the shadow is perhaps a good poetic way of describing materialism, because within that it fails to look up and see the spiritual influences that come into the world. And so at the Christmas time, we can remind ourselves of the influx of these Christmas impulses. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of the tree, and David can talk while I go get some books.
Oh, I hate it when John Barnwell does that. To answer some of John's previous points, I remember reading Leonard Cohen's book, Beautiful Losers. I've always loved Leonard Cohen as a performer. I didn't realize he was a frustrated writer. Apparently, he felt he was getting nowhere when he started out as a novelist. And did he write that book in the early days? Something is reminding me that somehow he did. Really lovely book, really lovely book. So that was always at the back of my mind. You know, how does a writer keep body and soul together? Sometimes you become an international singer of extremely qualitative lyrics. So that's my reminiscence of Leonard Cohen. And as I say, I love his music, but the book was good too. Speaking of Austrians, wasn't it the Führer? I mean, that man intrigues me sometimes for the right reasons. He's got the entire world thinking he's German, when of course, in fact, he was Austrian. So that's a bit of nifty footwork. And of course, the Austrians have done their best to make sure everybody thinks he's German. So that's a bit of European history which maybe needs to be explored at one point. When it comes to the Agathos written by Zoroaster, I know it's Zarathustra interchangeably with Zoroaster. Some of my Persian friends, I'm privileged to have Persian influences in my life, say that they prefer Zoroaster. I've no idea why. I'm sure there's some hugely technical psycholinguistic issue, but I don't know what it is. I remember reading the Agathos when I was an undergraduate, just new at King's College, and oh my God, there's a copy of the Agathos on the shelf. I was going to have a quick look, and I didn't last 5 minutes. It's poetry. It's insightful beyond belief. I had to put it down because I had this incredible feeling I was reading a modern mind. It was the sort of mind that lives in the 20th century as opposed to all those thousands of years ago. At that particular instance, I found it incredibly unsettling. And it was only a couple of years later that I actually went to reading it again. And that incredible, that wonderful, that astounding material never lets you down. And you can see it's the core of so much that came later. And certainly a type of theology that's identifiable in Israel and identifiable in Christendom. Rather like Kierkegaard, I hate the word Christendom. He used that word for every way the church goes wrong. There's Christianity and then there's Christendom. Therefore, point taken, Soren, a man I respect beyond measure. But, don't make so much of it because, anything can go wrong. But the point is, as a given series of institutions, it's identifiable as an ideology and as much more than an ideology in those thought streams. What intrigued me about Zoroaster, and of course that's why Nietzsche, never to be an underrated man, attacked Zarathustra. He sees him as the point of origin for all moral discourse. Thus Spake Zarathustra is a clever and brilliantly written book. In poetry, of course, Germans tend to write philosophy in terms of, in structural poetic terms, which is a beautiful way of doing it. Either aphorisms, not really arguments, or poetic discourse. And of course, the premise there is, well, okay, Zarathustra has been around all this time, and what does he make of what he said in the first place? So, would he still say those things if he was around now? So Zarathustra comes back down the mountain in Nietzsche's work to say, maybe I got it a bit wrong. But hey, no, he didn't. 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 There's good and there's bad. There's light and there's dark. That's the structure of the world. It doesn't necessarily make you a dualist. It can do, but it doesn't necessarily do that. And, with the deepest respect to a brilliance like Nietzsche's, no, it's a brilliant piece of work and it's always good to be challenged, but no, that's not the point. And in historical terms, certainly, what appears to be happening is that Zoroaster, at least on one level, is writing against the new metallic weapons, iron weapons, I can't remember, it's very long ago, but metallic weapons that are being used in that part of the world at his time. And he's basically saying, look, the people that use this type of weaponry, surely they can't be really in communion with the powers of light. I mean, if they were, they wouldn't do those things, which is why some people have said, reverses Hindu scriptures and makes the Asuras into the angels. Of course, the Asuras in Hindu thinking, it's a weird way of doing it. They're deep demonic in Hindu thinking, although it's very far from simple, very far from clear about what's good and bad in Hinduism. Not that they're moral relativists or theological relativists, they're not. They just quite rightly think these issues are massively complex. So Zoroaster makes the Asuras into angels and the Devas into demons, even though in Hinduism, of course, Deva means shining one. You can't help feeling that what you're on the verge of there is a series of mysteries. They're not the sort of things that can be debated and solved in a university common room. You're looking at things that only direct spiritual perception can actually clarify, as part of a living journey. I mean, I'm always nowadays, one of the joys of 62 is you're not taken in by everybody's smart idea. There are lots of smart ideas flowing around the world, but good, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily right. I mean, one of my pet irritations is Alain de Botton and the School of Life. Listen, love, yes, you're bright, and then, you haven't solved the riddle of existence, the riddle of history, the riddle of the universe. And I think we've got to be very careful of that. I mean, I know Richard Dawkins. What is Richard Dawkins? A highly respected British scholar who can get things wrong. There, the end of the story. His views on religion are barbaric, and he wouldn't survive the first week of Theology 101. I mean, this is nonsense. But there we are. It doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater. In terms of Zoroastrianism, you get to a point where scriptures run out and they are infused with the spirit of holiness and the spirit. You get to a point ultimately where the sanctity of scripture must take you on an actual journey. And that really, I think, is what Zoroaster is talking about. And he's saying, look, I may have done these things, and I suspect I'm right in doing so, if that's what he did. But, is this entering you as a person? Is the light entering your heart and your mind? Because if it's not, then you've actually understood nothing about what I'm saying. I'll hand back to you on that pregnant point, John.
Pregnant point. Actually a relevant word. Just coming up to the Christmas season. The fecund female aspect of it, and that whole concept of the birth of purity. Yeah, well, see, if you get into understanding the tradition itself, like you can go, for example, to the ancient writing of the Desatir. And in the Desatir, they talk about a whole series of Zarathustras or Zoroasters. And so it became a title. And it's much like I frequently make reference to Dionysius, the Areopagite, the first bishop of Athens that was converted by St. Paul, because you have the writings attributed to Dionysius or Dionysus. But they're frequently referred to as the writings of pseudo Dionysius, because they say, well, from linguistic analysis, we can see that the way in which the language is handled, that it's not as early as that. And yeah, it may be that, but Rudolf Steiner makes the point of that it was a tradition within that school that eventually came to be written down. And that's the important thing to understand. The important point, and this brings into a context a conversation I was having with one of my Facebook friends who's from Russia, and his name is in Russian, and I hadn't had a chance to look it up yet, so I can't even tell you what his name, but why out him? But he was, I had posted that quotation of Rudolf Steiner's, where Rudolf Steiner translated the first 14 verses of the Gospel of John. And he was making a critique based on linguistic analysis. This is a guy who's studied Hebrew and the Greek, the Koine Greek, and so he's going at it from a linguistic analysis. And so I posted a comment, and I won't read it here because people don't seem to like when I read longer passages. But the essence of the thing was that in the fourth post-Atlantean period, the Greco-Roman period in which the Christ event occurred, that at that time, mankind still had a relationship to the living world of the etheric in their abilities. And so when one would say, for example, the concept of the Word made flesh, that they would understand it in a certain way more profoundly than we would, because they would have more of a direct relationship to it as something that stream into mankind. And the whole idea in John, where he talks about the still small voice, that inner voice of conscience, that's when the journey begins as we transform from the Mars period to the Mercury period of evolution, as it's described, in giving birth to that sun nature from our own being, but it's born out of this voice of conscience. Yes, and so that's the birth of the child, the Christ child in your heart. That's that ancient child effect, you could call it, because you have this seed that's a seed of a future sun being, that is a being that's participating in that light. And so it's through participating in the light that all the Christmas has got all these lights, everything's all lit up, and everybody, why are they keep reminding us of this? Because We're entering into this period of darkness. And so it behooves us to be able to take up the task of being servants of that light. And so I think that that's a big part of the Christmas season. And so you have the idea of the three magi, Caspar, Balthazar, and Melchior, coming to the Christ child, whereas in the Gospel of Luke, what is it? It's the simple shepherds with their flocks, and they come to the Christ child, and then there's the Alleluia resounding, that beautiful image, so that you have these two very different perspectives on that time of year. And Rudolf Steiner is very specific in making the point of that you should understand the four synoptic gospels as representing like different facets of the Christ mystery, and that we've only begun to move toward where a great deal more will be capable of being realized in the consciousness of those individuals that take up this journey, so to speak. And so, in my mind, I think I want to make a point here before I forget. Again, we're here with Reverend David William Parry from merry old England in London, not in the city of London proper. He doesn't live in the square mile, but he does live in an interesting neighborhood. And he's quite a celebrated individual in his own right through all of his endeavors in the artistic world of theater and drama and poetry and literature, and celebrated mostly for his Mount Athos Inside Me, essays on religion, Swedenborg and the arts. And he also has a Shakespearean study, The Grammar of Witchcraft. No, it's not a book on witchcraft, it's a Shakespearean study, and his inspired poetry, Caliban's Redemption. All of these are available on Amazon. And for myself, my first book, my primary text of 640 pages, is the Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail. And in here is a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And then the sequel to that is, let's see if I can center that, the Arcana of Light on the Path, based on the 22 verse structure of the book Light on the Path by Mabel Collins, that was the first meditation guide text that Rudolf Steiner used when he was the head of the esoteric section in the Theosophical Society in Germany. But included in these is a series of esoteric diagrams to help you understand all the various facets of this. Whoop. I got get it out of my hand there. It's hard to control this, but there's a great many subjects that are covered, and that's that Star Wisdom aspect of which we're talking about today. And to be able to have a conscious relationship to this in-streaming wisdom so that it can become a repository in the Grail of the heart, so that you can give birth to love. And that's that going forth, that connecting to other people. And that's that universally human aspect of caring, really caring about other people rather than being closed off like Lucifer and self-contained effulgence. I remember that Lucifer represents that reflected light. He's not the source of the light. He's but a light bearer, although he is a real being. That is something that Rudolf Steiner is adamant about. We have to understand that Lucifer and Ahriman are very real beings. The very first mention of Ahriman, of course, that's an old Persian term that comes from Zarathustra. And if you read in the Zendavesta and his other writings, you see that he's the antagonist in the whole drama, the struggle between Ahura Mazda, the being of light, the great sun being of light, against the spirit of darkness and materiality. And of course, to come to a more universally human integration of these traditions, that was the mission of an individual named Mani. Of course, we don't really have time to talk too much about that today. Perhaps I'll do another episode on that. But that's one of the central themes that's addressed in my book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel. And so in understanding how Manichaeism, which most people really, to tell you the truth, have never heard of, and what is it? They may have heard Manichaean relative to being a dualistic view of the world, which in a superficial assessment is the case, and that's the way it's classically used, because of course we have to keep in mind that the modern understanding of Manichaean teachings is based on its opponents. Okay, primarily Augustine. And in the writings of Augustine, because for a while he was a member of the Manichaean community, and then he rejected it and entered into a more traditional Christian perspective. But it's his disputations against the Manichaeans, of which they were primarily known until in quite recent times. There's been numerous discoveries of Manichaean writings. And there's actually still Manichaeans that exist. I was in a Facebook group with some Manichaeans some years ago, but I lost track. I don't even know if it's still out there. They're interesting characters. They're active movement in Vietnam to this day. So they didn't totally disappear, even though the church attempted to obliterate them. But the accusations against the troubadours and the Albigensian crusade were basically that they were Manichaean influenced. And so you have that underpinning that's very significant, and we can explore it sometime. But getting back to this whole Persian mystery, Rudolf Steiner was really the innovator in modern times of attempting to come to terms with what the difference is between Lucifer and Ahriman. Even Goethe didn't know that, and so you see that in Faust, Mephistopheles is kind of a conjoining of Lucifer and Ahriman, which they tend to do anyways. So it's easy to come to that conclusion, but it's very much Miltonian, shall we say, the writings of Paradise Lost that tended to bring those two together as if it were just one being. And that's been a source of confusion for some time. But as I discussed in a previous episode, even known musically by Franz Liszt, that is apparent in the themes that are portrayed in his music, in some of his music. I don't want to get into that too much right now, because that's quite a long trail to get you to understand. And you can go back to previous episodes and find that. But in regards to understanding that there's that whole thing about, yes, you brought up the Devas and the Asuras. And Asura is a very particular word. And it has as a term can represent a certain order of beings that Rudolf Steiner describes that stayed behind in the old Saturn existence, right? And the Azura is old Saturn beings that stay behind. Ahriman is old sun beings that stay behind. And Lucifer is old moon beings that stay behind. So those are the first three phases before we came to the fourth world, which we're now presently in. And so that's just a little hint that one can find. One goes to the Rudolf Steiner Archive.org, rsarchive.org, that my friend James Stewart maintains in Ann Arbor here, near Detroit here. That's an invaluable resource. And of course, it's great to be generous and donate towards his cause because he works so diligently. If you wish to buy a cup of coffee for myself or for David, then my handle for that is paypal.me/John Barnwell 888, just like it shows on the screen here. And for David, it's paypal.me/DPerry777, just like it shows on his screen here, leaving out the he, him, his, which I still haven't had explained to me, but that's okay. And so if you get into understanding, going back to what I was saying when I mentioned that the peoples of the book in the Islamic tradition, and the Sabians were an interesting one because you have the reception of the Greek writings coming in through the Lebanon and into Syria and Western Iran and those regions, leading to the court of Harun al-Rashid and the whole Palace of Miracles that was maintained there, being the Rudolf Steiner calls it the birthplace of natural science, and which is a fascinating thing because there isn't that much made of Harun al-Rashid within the tradition unless you study very deeply. But yet he is to be found to be, he's an important character in 1001 Arabian Nights, right, where the story of Ala-ad-Din comes out of, and so many different wonderful stories. And so he was contemporary with Charlemagne, and that was in the 8th century, and that he had presented gifts to Charlemagne. And so you see that the writings of Dionysius the Areopagite came into the court of Charlemagne in the 8th century. And then you have the translation by them. There was more than one translation made, but the most noted one was John Scotus Erigena. And he, not to be confused with Duns Scotus, but John Scotus Erigena was said to be a scholar that came from the schools in Ireland. And of course, it's well known that it was the Irish monks that brought about the conversion of Europe, like St. Gall in Switzerland, and the various monks that went out and could convert, were capable just by the presence of their being and the capacity of people at that time to be able to perceive that there was a significant being before them, that was what was the transformative impulse that worked so strongly, that enabled the Christian monks to be able to convert Europe. Of course, not that it was without incident, because some of them did meet untimely demise, shall we say. So there's people of varying capacities, but you can look at the barbarians coming into Rome and the barbarian invasion and see when they finally get to the Vatican and they see the Pope sitting in his chair before the Vatican, and they perceive the powerful archangels on either side, and they retreated. They recognized that there was something profound happening, and they stopped. I mean, that's the legendary story. I think that's an interesting account of being able to transform one's environment through presence of being. And so that's a wonderful image to work with. And that's part of this image of light that we're working with in this Christmas season here. And David, can you share anything that might be some questions you might have for your friends in the Royal Asiatic Society about exploring some of the themes of the Manichaeans or Zarathustra?
I'm a fellow in two Royal Societies. The RAS, the Asiatics, I think they're the real scholars, if I'm honest. I'm not that there aren't any in the other one. I think they're the real scholars. Oh gosh, you said so many things there. Celtic Christianity is vibrant and lively and still very powerful. I mean, certainly in Britain, you had the two meet. You had Roman Christianity and Celtic Christianity encounter each other. It didn't turn into a battle. I mean, it was sort of mutual incomprehension. Celtic Christianity tends to be innately mystical. Roman Christianity at that time tended to be very worldly, but applying gospel principles to different issues, and there's nothing wrong with that. Certainly, the idea of the druid, the priest magician. I mean, they were prevalent in the early church, particularly in the Celtic church, and many people have said, well, what is a priest and what is a druid? And I think looking back, those are actually very fair questions. Druidism probably, of course, goes back to India. Dravidians, that's one of the link words there. That's one of the source words there. And there's nothing, we've got to embrace all of the great perennialist treasures of the different religious traditions and try and make sense of it all. They're not simply competing ideologies. They're all insights into the ineffable. And we've got to try and, like Steiner, I mean, I'm very proud to be able to tell you, John, that I'm well on my way to becoming a member of the society again. I got this lovely email during the week from the British Membership Secretary who sent my application off to Switzerland. And therefore, there's a rebirth in that. And I'm very, very happy. I'm very, very proud. It's rather like my MCC days. I'm not quite sure why I left, although in MCC terms, I'm very sure why I walked away for a while and are now coming home. In Steinerian, I think in Steinerian circles, in anthroposophical circles, it was more of a question of perplexity. There's so much going on here, and there's so much of great depth and profundity. Can I get through it all? So that was my attitude to anthroposophy, and it's good to be back. And yeah, okay, give it on the chin, and let's try and work it all out this time. Much more exciting. Druids. Certainly the druidic ideal, men and certainly women, but one mustn't forget there were druidesses, were known for their power. I mean, it was W.B. Yeats that talked, I can't remember in which poem offhand, that talked about the druids debating whether they liked the teaching of the new druid Patrick or not, and did it fit in with their view? And they thought it didn't, they thought it didn't. And some of them thought he was being a bit uppity, and others thought it was a fruition of what the previous druids had said. I mean, that's a very, very clever guy, W.B. Yeats. So certainly there's all that going on. Yeah, I can see why druidry still has that appeal. I mean, there's a Church of England vicar whose name escapes me at the minute, who says he's also a druid, and for him the chief druid is Jesus Christ himself. That is interesting. That's innovative. And who can say nay to something so positive, enlightening, and spiritual? Where are the bloody druids when you need them? It's time for you to come back and help us all out a bit. For heaven's sake, do it. We're all asking. In terms of the Asiatics, gosh, you mentioned Manichaeism. Rather like yourself, my Christmas reading, my treat to me is to finally make time to read your books over the Christmas period. So that's my treat to me, no matter what condition I find myself in. I'm looking forward to that. I suspect the Manichaeans are very misunderstood indeed. I mean, there's a temple, a Manichaean temple in northern China that's still going. And if you listen to what they're saying, they're not saying what Augustine would have said they were saying. And if you start thinking about what they're meant to have proclaimed, were they actually talking about the flesh, or were they talking about something like Heil? Was that what they saw was the real problem? This clinging on to bodies of desire beyond their sell-by date, beyond the useful. I suspect there's something much deeper going on there. I mean, Elaine Pagels, a very great scholar of Christian gnosis, said years ago, I remember only TV, I remember seeing her on TV during one of those incredible interviews they used to give in the old days when intellectuals were still allowed on TV, as opposed to shaken out of studios and chased off the premises. She was saying, if anyone had gone to Mani, or they'd have gone to any of the great Gnostics, Valentinus, of course, is the influence on me, and said to them, "Are you a Gnostic?" The answer would have been, "I don't know what you're talking about." And she said, "Yeah, Mani and the Manichaeans thought they were Christians. They thought they were Christians with a particular view of it all, but they thought they were Christians." And certainly Mani, as I think I've said on this show before, if you'd have said to him, "Are you a Gnostic?" he'd have said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a Catholic priest." So we've got to be careful of not addressing the ancient materials in the correct way, with the respect and time and courtesy they deserve. In terms of I'd love to be able to do something on the Manichaeans with the Asiatics, with the RAS. Of course, they moved west. They moved towards China. Well, they were west, and they moved towards China. In northern China to this day, Mani is still remembered as the Buddha of light. And what intrigues me about the Central Asians, a part of the world I love to bits, it's my genuine passion, one of my genuine passions, is those boys don't do things by half measures. If you have a war with somebody, they will tear down your entire city and leave nothing standing. And you're somehow less of a warrior if you don't do that. That's a habit we've got to repulse in the West, I suspect. And it's something the Central Asians are beginning to regret having done century after century. Whole libraries, what are those buggers? They went around building hospitals and libraries. Oh my God, the bounders! Why can't they stop doing all these good works? What's wrong with them? So of course there are whole libraries of Manichaean theology that have been shredded, literally, and are just being unearthed in that part of the world. Shreds, fragments of gloriously illuminated manuscripts are beginning to be discovered. One caught my attention a couple of months ago, where a Manichaean priest is holding up the host, a consecrated host above a chalice, and beams of light are coming from it. And I was trying to read the material that accompanied this discovery, and the scholar involved was convinced it wasn't meant to be seen on a metaphorical level. It was meant to be seen as an actual beaming, illuminated host. I mean, gosh, so they thought they were somehow eating light. They thought they were somehow internalizing light. What a wonderful thought. So that, of course, excuse me, is something I would love to do with them. But as usual, that it's funding and time. Certainly it's something I want to do, because I believe they've had a previously unsuspected influence on Christianity. What makes me think that is he's come up before, Dennis Wheatley. Somebody asked him once about Manichaeanism and Christianity, and I thought he gave a really compelling answer. In the darkness things wither and die, but in the light they prosper and they thrive. And gosh, but that's a Manichaean answer to a Manichaean question. And of course he would have seen himself, he wouldn't really have said he was a Christian. I mean, he had the whole Christendom thing. It's very easy to see what's wrong with the church, sadly. It's less easy in our modern times to see what's right with the church. And let's remember, it's doing an awful lot of things right, and it's doing a lot of good work. And there are armies of ministers, nuns, priests, pastors that are doing good work for their communities and the religious life of the human race on a weekly level, daily and weekly level. Let's not forget that. And there are a few bad apples in every walk of life. Let's not forget that. And yes, there are systemic issues in certain churches. But isn't the miracle that it's all come to light and that now we're all beginning to discuss it? That's the real miracle. These things can't be obscured forever. My own, I promise I'll hand back any second, John. My own view of, even Kierkegaard could not entirely drop, he could drop the ball sometimes. Was it the fact that the pagans of passion and reason alone was baptized? That's paraphrasing one of his famous sayings. I think the answer is yes and no to that. The big mistake the early church made to my mind, and of course there are other issues we can talk about in the weeks ahead, is that they rejected sexuality under the influence of the Desert Fathers, under the influence of the ascetics, and made it this sort of supplementary issue. And even that's ironic because they said so much about it. They made it a supplementary issue instead of exploring it through the theology of an incarnation. The blessed Savior, our light, incarnated into this world, and God so loved the world that he gave us his only son, Christ Jesus. Therefore, you can't just forget the things of the world and the mechanics of the world because they're holy. I'll hand back to you, John.
Well, again, I'm reminded of Marie Steiner. When you made the statement, our highest endeavor must be to develop free human beings who are able of themselves to impart purpose and direction to their lives. And Marie Steiner, Rudolf Steiner's wife, and a profound person, extremely profound person in her own right, and very much came out of the world of theater, of which is your sphere of influence. How the plays that you've written, and the plays you've acted in, plays you've directed. That whole theater impulse that's so inherently British was also a very important aspect of the, and still is, of the Goetheanum in Dornach, Switzerland. And there's been influences from Rudolf Steiner that have streamed out into the world of theater, and I think we'll be exploring that on some future episodes here. Specifically, Michael Chekhov, who attended lectures of Rudolf Steiner and was so influential, being a teacher of some important actors in the United States, Marlon Brando, Marilyn Monroe, and Jack Palance, and numerous other people. And then there's also the Russian Stanislavski that was so important, and so it's in that whole milieu of the world of theater. Remember that Goethe was responsible and ran the theater in Weimar, and he had productions going on there. He was responsible for bringing the works of Shakespeare to the German stage. And then you have his associate Schiller, who was a playwright, right? And the play of William Tell, which is so important. So that it's that whole idea of the gesture that's the sacrament of the Mass, right? It's being able to actually bring the divine, the consciousness of the divine into human activity. And of course, I like to remember this story, and I've used the story many times, but it's, for me, an inexhaustible source of renewal is when I would go to the church service at the Christian community, the service of which was written by Rudolf Steiner, and they would get to the point of the Mass, the consecration of mankind, which is the festival or feast of the Eucharist at the end of the service. But every time I go there, a busload of mentally handicapped children would show up from one of the handicap centers, and they would be there, and they'd all be just totally involved in their world, arms flapping around, bobbing, swiveling their heads, just really not quite clearly connected to this world. But then once it got to the point in the Mass where they consecrated the host, they all became still and silent and gazed directly at the host. And so there was a miracle translating at that time. Is a subtle miracle because you had to look for it, but it was evident every time I went there. And Rudolf Steiner had once made the point to Ehrenford Pfeiffer, I forget which Christian community priest it was, but it doesn't matter, because he said that Jesus Christ is always present at the Eucharist, and so that is a wonderful mystery that we can consider in the Easter time. But in this time right now, we're looking at the Alleluia and the purity of childhood, out of which we have our most direct relationship to the higher levels of the spiritual world in our first 3 years or so of childhood. And so, with that being said, I'm thinking back, and by the way, I don't think I even mentioned, but my books are available on eBay. David's are on Amazon, and it's always such a pleasure having our friends here and being able to chat a little bit. And yes, I do look forward to the possibility of there being pew reunions with Roseanne Barr and Leo Zagami and Lowell Joseph Gallen, and it was quite an international set. Not quite the Clifton set, but we had our own little set going there. So in that regards, David, I want to wish you a very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Now, if you could lead us in the prayer that we're so accustomed to sharing at the end of our broadcast.
I'm not sure whether that means this is our last show before the Christmas period. I'll have to message you offhand if it when we're off the air. If it is a very Merry Christmas to you, my good friend, and a very Happy New Year to you and yours. I was just thinking a couple of things. Merry England. Merry, of course, in the ancient sense, used to mean blessed. I'm not sure many people would say that currently, but you never know. It happened once. It might happen again. One last thing before I get to the prayer. I think it was Mel Brooks, I can't remember the movie offhand, that said, without homosexuals and Jews, there is no theatre. And yeah, but he's right. He's right. Yeah, I've had the great privilege of working in British theatre and poetry, and there's a direct interaction, direct exchange between the two, which we can also discuss at some point. I'm putting some of my old plaudits on social media at the minute, just in case they get lost. But anyway, it's a privilege, and yes, one thing I do see in Athos is I think there's a very great difference between theatrical enactment and religious enactment, which I need to explore. It's only touched on. And obviously they're related, but I think there's also a distinction which I need to write a whole book about at some point. But not yet. Not yet. Friends of this show, and including the pew, because I loved it too. I know we both did. And if anything ever happens, that's great. But I'm also equally happy on this show. I'm putting my thumbs up there. Friends of this show, my dear friend John, viewers, listeners, we're coming to the longest night of the year, where everything is uncertain, everything is in the dark, and it's very, very difficult to see a way forward. But there's always light at the end of the tunnel. And those of us who hold a Christian faith remember more than at any other time of year that this is when the light is reborn with an even greater luster than the year before, lighting our way to every kiss and every hug that is a sign that our Messiah is returning. God bless you all. Amen.
Amen.